I wasn't sure exactly what the mix was going to be today, and so I suggested that maybe I could review some one presentation from last week's meeting in Washington at the translational science meeting. Actually, it was kind of CTSA / translational science last Tuesday. So this has to do with life after a KO2 award, in case anybody wondered what that might be like. All right, for those of you who are kind of in the middle of it now. And so what we did was we conducted a national survey of all of the KO2 alumni from like 2000, who had graduated by 2017. So not current scholars, these are former scholars. And this was collected earlier this year, and just what we presented last week was some really kind of a first pass through the data, preliminary results, and there was a lot of discussion around this and how generalizable it is and what additional analyses we should do, and should we control for this, that, or the other. But I'll just present kind of some raw data, and this is just an icebreaker to get the discussion going. We can continue along this path, or we can just talk about something completely different, having to do with mentoring or with careers in clinical and translational science, or whatever you'd like to do. I'm available for it. So, all right. Let's see. Oops, let's skip this one there. Okay, so some demographic data on the sample. We had about 750 respondents, which was a response rate of 42%. Again, we can discuss whether those 42% are representative of the full cohort or not. Maybe these people are happier, or maybe they're whatever. But anyway, that's not, in general, that's a pretty good response rate, but you could argue. Over half were female, and about a quarter were underrepresented minorities. Their median time on the KL2 was 2 years, with a range of 1 to 5. So 5, some of the earlier scholars who had started, in 2006 or whatever, had 5-year KL2 awards. Nowadays, there essentially is no such thing as a 5-year KL2 award. Most of them are 2 years, 3 years, something in that range. Median time since the KL2 support ended was 4 years, with a range of 1 to 10. And most have been less than 6 years out since their grant, since their award ended. Currently, 80% were assistant or associate professors. And interestingly, almost half said they have some kind of administrative or leadership role at their institution. So I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is the kind of some demographic data, and I mentioned 80%. Let's see if this mouse works here. Okay. This yellow is associate professors, 41%. Gray is assistant professors. And then we have, in blue, dark blue here, we have full professors. Then some kind of research assistant professors here, instructors, and other. We asked them what area of translational science they are currently engaged in, and you could check more than one. So this one is public health, clinical implementation, clinical research was the most common answer, preclinical research. I think I'm getting some feedback from the, should I turn one of these off? Preclinical research. Is there an echo? Anyway, whatever. Basic research, and then other. Okay, this is the number of years since the KL2 support has ended, starting with like less than 1 over here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. As I said, most have been off for less than 6 years. And this is the leadership data. We don't have denominators here, so these are raw counts. I can't tell you, how many were total were in that particular cohort. These are cross-sectional results. So you can't really make much of, you can't really extrapolate this longitudinally. But I thought the interesting thing was, you know, people are in leadership roles, some very early on and some kind of mid-career and some kind of even later on. So it's a nice distribution of people engaged in leadership one way or another post KL2. We asked them about how they fund themselves, how do they pay for themselves, and this I thought was interesting too. So about 90% of them are getting institutional funds, about 20% or so are getting clinical revenues. And now I should say that the sample is a mixture of clinicians and non-clinicians, and I can't tell you how many of each. So that's going to be a weighted average of however many clinical MDs there were versus non-clinicians. Grant funding at about 48%, and then some people are doing some teaching and some other ways of generating their salary. And then this is the same data broken down by years since their KL2 ended, going from less than 1 year all the way up to 10 years. Purple is institutional support, green's clinical, gray is grant, orange is teaching, and blue is other. And again, without denominators, you can't really tell, but it's pretty consistent, it seems, across the number of years out. It's not like, I'm not sure what you'd expect. I don't know if you'd expect more institutional support early on and maybe transition. I don't know. Anyway, there were 115 people who said they have no grant funding at all. Okay. Then we asked them, are you a PI or are you co-PI on the grants that you're getting funding for? And about 45% saying PI, 15% co-investigator. We asked them, did you apply for funding during your KL2 award? In other words, for an individual K or an R or something like that. And most people did, 82% applied for a grant during their grant period. In our program, it's an expectation that you do that in your second year. I don't know what it's like here, if you give a timeline for that, or, yeah.
It's an expectation.
Yeah.
Everybody's able to do it.
Right. Certainly not everybody's able to obtain funding within 2 years, but they're supposed to, at least in our place, they're supposed to apply for it. Okay, so then we asked them what kinds of grants did you apply for during your KL2 award period? And this first set of bars is an individual career development, whether it's an NIHK or a VA career development award or something like that. This next set of bars is industry-sponsored clinical trials, investigator-initiated clinical trials, NIH grants, R01s or equivalents, smaller grants, R21s or R03s, foundation, organizational support, etc. And the gray bars indicate did not apply for this type of grant. The orange ones are applied but then not received, and the blue is received. So you can see a lot of people trying to get or succeeding in getting another individual K award, and then I guess the second most common here would be R awards and foundation grants. Not many people had applied for industry-sponsored grants or investigator-initiated clinical trials. Okay, so then after your K funding ended, your KL2 funding ended, did you apply for extramural funding as PI or multi-PI? And about 80% again said yes, 20% said no. And again, which kinds of grants did you apply for after your KL2 award? Same kind of categories, individual career development award, industry-sponsored clinical trial, investigator-initiated clinical trial, R01, so you can see now a lot more activity here in terms of people applying but not receiving and applying and receiving. And then the R21 and R03s over here. We asked them what kinds of grants have you served on as a co-investigator since your KL2 appointment. And these are ends, these are not percentages. Industry-sponsored clinical trial, investigator-initiated clinical trial, R01, R21, or R03, foundation, other federal sources. Okay, so then we said, well, that's all good. What are the goals of your work? And you could choose more than one thing. So this is to influence health policy. This is to develop or disseminate a novel methodology with an impact on human health, to help create guidelines, to develop a device, to develop new drug indications or repurpose existing drugs, or to change the paradigm and understanding the pathophysiology of disease or other. So I think, again, a nice mix of phases of translational science. So then again, we asked them, what impact do you think your work has had so far? And the categories are: purple is none at all, the kind of green, bluish green is little, then the gray is some, yellow is much, and light blue is a great deal. So here it's influenced health policy, develop or disseminate a novel methodology with impact on human health. Next bar is create guidelines, then potential new device, new drug indications, and understanding the pathophysiology of disease. And so I think the good news here is that most people said they at least had some impact. Their work has had some impact, so gray, yellow, or blue in each of these areas. Not too many thought they had no impact. We asked them if they thought they were being paid fairly for what they do. So here, we do have percentages. So about 13% strongly agreed with that. 42% said they agree, 19% neutral, 19% disagreed, and 6% strongly disagreed. So over half agreed or strongly agreed that they were fairly paid at this stage of their career, wherever it was. We asked them if they thought their work was meaningful. And more good news here. So these people strongly agreed, and these people agreed. And then a few people were neutral, and hardly anybody disagreed with that. So 94% agreed or strongly agreed that what they were working on was meaningful. And we asked them how satisfied they were with the direction in which their career was progressing. Very satisfied, satisfied, neutral, dissatisfied, very satisfied. So about 82% agreed or strongly agreed that their careers were heading in a satisfactory direction. So we asked them, okay, well, during your KL2 award period, which opportunities were available to you either through the program or through your institution? And in each, I'll go through the sets of bars, but in each one, the first gray bar is not available, orange is available but didn't utilize, blue is available and utilized. So strong mentorship, almost all agree that it was available and they utilized it. Protected time, and by definition, they should have had that. Pilot grants. This is interesting because some places, KL2 scholars are ineligible for additional pilot funding because we already give them $25,000 and we want to spread our resources out. I don't know what it's like here. Are they eligible for pilots?
They usually don't have them concurrently. They would have a K and then a pilot. But they don't
Not concurrently. So after their K. Oh yeah, certainly after their K.
Yeah.
But during their K. All right. Then this one is collaborations. We had talked about team science during the day today. So these people felt like they were, these opportunities were available and they participated. This is grant writing training, K clubs and things like that, mock reviews of your grant proposals, time management training. Yeah, that was kind of a mix. Didactic training in clinical and translational science. Really, all of CTSA should offer that, some form or another. Research support staff and services. Leadership training. We don't explicitly offer that. I don't know. development of an individual development plan. This is becoming more and more common. I think these results reflect some of the older scholars who didn't have, or didn't even know what an IDP was 12 years ago, but now I do. Peer mentoring, externships, and again, this is a new thing, so not that many people have taken advantage of externships yet. And we can talk about externships if you'd like after this. And then training in entrepreneurship and loan repayment programs. So then we said, well, to what extent did these contribute to your career success or progression? The loan repayment program, entrepreneurship training, externships, et cetera, And the blue was a great deal, and yellow is much. So you can see that collaborations, pilot grants for those who had them available, protected time, strong mentorship. These were kind of the top areas that people felt were helpful in their career progression. We were curious to know whether debt incurred during training influenced their career decisions. And we were surprised to find that all these people here said not at all. And these people said slightly. So only a small fraction said always consideration, and the others were others and moderately. So over half of respondents said that financial debt incurred during training didn't influence their career decisions. That might mean that they didn't have financial debt or that they weren't worried about it. Again, there is a sort of a selection bias going on here, because if you were worried about that, you might not have applied for the KL2 program to begin with, because you would have been stuck getting, PGY salaries for, or junior faculty salaries for a few years. To what extent do you think your career in clinical and translational science is financially sound? Extremely, very, moderately, slightly, or not at all. Again, the news here is pretty good. I suppose people who didn't think it was financially sound were gone and didn't respond, right? Opinions on how challenging it is to be a clinician or a teacher and a researcher. Surprisingly, 7% said it's not challenging. I'd like, 1% said it's not. I'd like to meet these 7 people. These folks said it was somewhat challenging, neutral, and then almost everybody thought it was challenging or very challenging. So if you're nodding your head, you're not alone. We all find it a challenge. Are you satisfied with your work-life balance? These guys were very satisfied. These guys were somewhat satisfied, not satisfied, very unsatisfied. Is that encouraging? Or I don't know, is this encouraging? I don't know. Okay, let me end there, and just if you have any general comments on what you think your experience is relative to this, or what your expectations are relative to this. Life after, doesn't have to be after a KL2 necessarily, it could be after whatever stage of training you're in right now, or we're in. Are you hopeful? Are you ready to bail? Where are you?
Well, we'll steer here, so we're hopeful.
Okay. Hopefully I'm ready. Depends what day of the week I ask you. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, and maybe, I don't think from there you can figure out what type of K award and K awards the applicants went through. But maybe at your institution, after a KL2, what do they go for? What do they get?
We have some national data, not here. I'm not sure if it's in my extra slides or not, but NCATS has collected data on funding success rates for subsequent grants. And the number that sticks out in my head is roughly 50% of KL2 scholars get funding through Ks or Rs at some point. At our place, and we run a small KL2 program, what I've found is it depends on a couple of things. One is what your mentor thinks is right for you. And that can depend a lot on, are they basic scientists or are they clinical researchers? The basic scientists, and I'm just generalizing, don't quote me, but tend to go more for R01s, more for from KL2s or whatever R01s. The clinicians find the 75% protected time really valuable and like to continue life on a K as long as possible. We talked about that earlier. So you can go from a 2-year KL2 to a 4-year K23 and get 6 years total.
One of the things we talked about earlier that's true at your place and at ours is there's been a transition in the length of the KL2 support. When we started the program here, and I think when you started your program, we were doing 5 years of support, and that's not the case any longer. So it's often difficult in 2 years, depending on, again, where you are when you come in, and it has been a bit more competitive with both the partner network and just by design to get one of these awards. But depending on when you come in, many people find that that additional period of extramural K support is needed and beneficial. But if you can write an R, fantastic.
Yeah, so this is where individual development plans, I think, can be really helpful, because you can look in the mirror and say, okay, I either need more career development or I don't. You know, I have 16 papers and I'm ready for my R01 or whatever. Or, you know, I'm ready to do a big research project which requires R01 type funding.
You know, another interesting topic Joel, I'd like to get your thoughts on is, so if somebody thinks they don't want a K, further K, for whatever reason, or they're thinking about writing an R, they feel like they're ready, do you encourage an R01 or do you suggest R21s and R03s?
He's shaking. I'm shaking his head. What are you shaking? For what? Don't do the R21?
At least in the institutes that I'm accustomed to working with, an R21 is not simply a mini R01
No.
and then easier to get. It's for a very different purpose.
Right.
It's for a very different purpose.
Correct.
And if one thinks it's just sort of a junior R01, I think it's misreading the mechanism quite substantially.
Right.
Same for R03.
Yeah, so let me just give another perspective. I think, so the mechanisms differ depending on the institute. And so in NIAMS, for example, you can get an R21 for clinical trial planning. And that's a very specific use of it. It is not a mini R01. That much is clear. One of the advantages of an R21 is that you don't need preliminary data. Although I will tell you, just having finished a stint on NAMES, which is an EPI study section, that you do much better if you have preliminary data.
And that's true of a K.
And the other point that I think your point speaks to, and this is what I was wondering what you were going to say, Joel, is it's really, you know, the study section is told that they're not the same grants and they're not the same review criteria, but they get reviewed in a very similar way.
Yeah.
And so the amount of work that's involved in writing one is maybe a little less, but not a lot less.
Because it's
The amount of money is a lot less. And the scrutiny that it gets at most study sections is not that dissimilar.
Now, I agree 100%, but I just applied for an R21 recently.
There are times when an R21 is the appropriate mechanism.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for all of us to realize the R21 was not created as a mini R01.
Right.
It was created to fill a gap that
Something innovative that, or develop something that, yeah. So.
And most of the time, although I haven't done R21 reviews in a couple of years, it was clear R21s were conceptualized by the submitter as a mini R01.
Right.
With a lower bar of
Right.
review. And to your point, Ken, that doesn't happen.
Right. They're pretty hard to get.
Can I ask, since the question of follow-on funding has come up, there were some data last week that were presented by Catherine Harton, I believe, about timelines.
When to apply.
When to apply, when in the course of a career over a number of years, when do you apply, and what are the benchmarks for someone who may succeed or not, just in terms of timing of application?
So if I remember her presentation, we can probably, the slides are probably on click, or will be on click at some point soon. She was talking about a 5-year K award and when to start applying for an R. And the basic take-home message was the sooner the better. Even as early as year 2, which would be earlier than I would have counseled my people. Usually we start talking about year 3, definitely by year 4, but she was saying, you got to work backwards, right? You got to start with, I don't want a funding gap when my K ends. And so if you figure out backwards, okay, how many cycles am I going to have to go through to finally get this thing? So the start date will be the day after my K-23 ends. If you do the math that way, then you're backing into year 2 even. And I think that's what the take-home message was, right, from that. So again, she's really aggressive. Your daughter is her mentor, right? She's your daughter's mentor. And I can't argue with it. It's just, I guess this was new information to me.
So in that context, if you're on a K, these were KL2s or K23?
These were 5-year award K23s, right?
So they must
Or
have been
K.
K23s.
You know, the only issue I would take with that is, if you're starting to write your grant in year 2, when are you going to do your K work, right? I mean, you got a project that goes along with your K that you need to collect data for and write up and stuff, and you got classes you might be taking stuff. I wouldn't want to shortchange the career development part of the K, because after all, that's why you applied for the K and when you got it. I understand the urgency of getting your next grant on time and on schedule so that you're not a burden to your division director or something like that. But year 2 sounded early to me. I don't know what your opinions are on that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just curious if there are data about when people make the transition from the K to an R, what % of their effort really is available for research once they go to an R? Because I think for a lot of people, I mean, it depends on the kind of work you're doing, I guess, but most people can't support more than 40 or 50% of their effort on, or at least of their salary on the K, I mean, on the R. And so that transition, unless the institution is prepared to provide them with that difference between 40% and 75%, that tradition away from having 75% protected time to the reality of the future is a really tough one for a lot of people. And what are the statistics of how people make that transition?
It's a great point. So you kind of fall off a cliff when you go from 75 to, I think an average R01 PI effort is 30, right? So you're going from 75 to 30, and it can vary from 20 to 40 or something like that. All of a sudden you've had this golden period that you're never going to have again, 75% protected time for 5 years, 6 years, something like that. You're going to get your name on the UAB newsletter as soon as you get that R01, because you're a hero. And you're bringing in 55% FNAs or whatever it is here. That's great, you made it. But you're right, who's going to cover the other 45% gap? The solution in the old school people will say, well, just get 2 or 3 R01s. Yeah, well, okay, whatever you say. More realistically, maybe we do team science, right? Where you're a co-investigator on your grant, and her grant for parts of yours, and likewise, right? I mean, or you apply for foundation funding or industry funding or something. It's just too hard to get 3 R01s. I don't know who does that.
So one other additional comment on top of your great thoughts is there is another time when you might be able to have 75% support, and that's if you get a year or 2 further along and you apply for a K-24.
Oh, yeah.
Because that is a absolutely spectacular.
25 to 50.
Yeah.
I've actually had one of those.
I thought it was higher than that. But anyhow, it's a lot of support, and you can actually renew it. You can have it for up to 10 years.
Right.
So it's a really terrific grant that we tend to generally underutilize.
It's great. It's a mid-career mentoring award, which you have to have now. You have to have other funding to go along with that. So you have to have an RO1 or something like that. The idea behind it is that you will then get this grant, and you can, and I disagree with this completely, but you can then kind of delegate your RO1 work to somebody else while you're mentoring 3 other people. I mean, nobody delegates their RO1 stuff to somebody else. But it does cover, at least when I had it, up to 50% of your time. And yeah, that's great. That's right. That's right. So it's challenging, as you saw by the data here. I mean, you know, you have to have really thick skin. Most of us are used to being A students, you know, high school, college, whatever, and then we're getting rejected. We're not used to that. So.
I have a question. Recently I was reading kind of a blog for academic researchers about some advice they'd gotten from a more senior person who is kind of late career. And the more junior person was saying, I'm writing a lot of grants right now.
Mm-hmm.
The more senior person said, oh, that wasn't my approach. I would write one at a time, very good grants. And there's just this discussion on this blog about how that's no longer enough because you can submit, one good grant every 6 months, but in this competitive climate, it's unlikely that one good grant will get funded. And someone mentioned, but didn't give references to the fact that the frequency of grants has been shown to be the most predictive of success.
Frequency of submissions.
Frequency of submissions. And I'm just curious if that's true, if I'm not familiar with that data, if you would agree with that based on what you've seen.
Makes sense to me. I don't know any of us who are good enough to get grants on the first try every time. I mean, I think I knew one person like that, and I don't know if she's kept up that streak or not. But yeah, you just have to keep. I mean, the other extreme is that you chase every RFP out there, whether it's up your alley or not. I don't recommend that at all. And I've seen it recently. People have kind of gotten the word that they got to get grants, and so everyone that comes across the email, they apply for it. That's not a good strategy. You have to have. And here's where this individual development plan comes in again. It's like, okay, here's where I want to be in 1 year, 2 years. What's my strategy? You have to have a game plan. You can't just be randomly submitting stuff.
I agree, Joel. I think, like most things in biology, it's probably a U-shaped relationship. So too much and too little are bad. And by too much, if you're putting in grants that are not well written, and they're all getting triaged and they're not getting reviewed, it's really hard when you don't get a score to get it on the next try, and maybe not on the try after that. So that's a problem. So what you want to do is you want to put something that's good enough to get reviewed and to get a score and to be able to respond and to fix things. Best thing is you need more papers. You need more preliminary data. Don't wait for that. Put the thing in and hope that that's the critique. That's fixable. But I think at the same time, sitting around and trying to polish everything to the nth degree and being a perfectionist at a time when there is a probability game, this is also a bad strategy. So finding the sweet spot.
We're all sort of perfectionists.
And I would also say there's a sweet spot between opportunism and focus. So opportunism is responding to every RFA. Focus is great, but if you're too focused, you miss opportunities. So got to be somewhere, got to calibrate.
And a good mentor can help with that, right? The world's going to change around you. You need to be a little bit nimble, change directions a little bit, not necessarily overhaul, your career plans, but be alert as to what's happening out there.
One of the hardest things I find to give people really functional advice about is the problem that For the grants, there's a deadline every 4 months. For the papers, there's no explicit deadline. And yet, if you don't write your papers, you're sunk. So people have to figure out ways to create their own deadlines for their papers so that they continue to be at least as important as the grants they're writing, so that they get that foundational information.
Yeah, so that can be part of the IDP. We actually saw a demonstration of this online IDP that's being developed out of Pittsburgh and Penn, which is really cool, actually. And it allows you to put everything online, all your plan, your goals, your plans, your papers, your grants, whatever. Your mentor can then interact, can comment, can monitor. As soon as you've accomplished, your paper's been submitted, you check that off, and the mentor gets an email or whatever it is. But yeah, papers should have milestone. You're planning your however many papers it is for the year. Figure out when you're going to be able to submit them. Other topics?
One thing that I heard last week that I was surprised about was the average RO1, the average age for an RO1 was 44.
Yeah, it's going up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had not
That's a
heard
problem.
that before. Yeah.
That's a real problem. I don't have a real good answer for that. I think NIH recognizes that, but yeah, that number keeps going up.
Was that first RO1?
First RO1.
First RO1.
Yeah, first RO1.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a surprising statistic in a way, because you do get extra credit. You get scored differently for as a new investigator and a young investigator. Both those things put you into a slightly different tier and your percentile differently. And you also are less likely to be triaged, because we have to review a different percentage of those grants versus the established investigators.
So sorry, just to follow up, that's kind of inconsistent. I mean, I guess you spoke to the lag and some of the data you presented as folks that got their KL2, several years ago, but it seemed like from the data that people were transitioning to RO1s, and maybe it's that this is a more qualified subset relative to the average applicant.
I don't know if I have that slide with the.
So one other thing while he's pulling that up is that, back to the opportunism, there's periodically topics that are hot and that have a lot of money. Right now, if you're doing anything at all that has any feasible connection to Alzheimer's disease, you got a much higher percentage of getting funded than you do in other places. Opioids. And so sometimes, thinking about whether you can, if you find that at all interesting, if you think it's at all related to things that you have a scientific interest in, think about, can you spin it in that way? And is there something you can do? Can you collaborate? Can you build a team around something that relates to your topic, but also builds on a national priority, a hot area where there's extra money?
Yeah.
I was going to say, following up on that, I go up and advise new investigators to pick an RFA focus rather than that might focus their research rather than an RO1, because I think, and I'm interested to see if you agree with my reasoning, because you don't have to spend as much time convincing the agency that it's important.
Right.
They've already said this is important. If you can shift your interests into those areas, they've already said it's important. So you just have to justify why you're doing it the way you want.
Yeah, the RFA or program announcement or something.
And they're going to spend a certain amount of money,
Right.
almost assuredly.
And you know that, yeah.
Do y'all get the Friday bulletin, NIH, whatever, grants bulletin every week? Okay.
Like you have.
Oh, no.
I was just going to ask about, what do you feel about a somewhat junior person being a multi-PI? on an RO1. If you're offered that opportunity, so you're not going to be the sole PI, would you advise against if it's your first RO1, would you say, oh, you really should stay in the co-I categories that you're eligible for K awards, or take that multi-PI offer?
I have an opinion on that. Do you have an opinion on
I think it's an interesting dilemma, possibly a good one, in that it depends a little bit on the relationship with the other investigator. Are you at the same level in your career? If so, that might be more problematic than if one person's more senior and another's more junior, particularly if there's a mentoring relationship and if the plan is to pass the work along and off to that other person. But by having multi-PI, it strengthens the application. I think you've got to keep in mind that some money is generally better than no money. And getting funded is the key, and then often there's opportunities to even rearrange things afterwards, depending on how you get into it. But to try to leverage the opportunities that come along and take advantage of them. So I don't think I would not turn it down if it sounded appealing.
Yeah, I think I'd have to answer that on an individual case-by-case basis. If you're ready for an RO1, I think you're ready for an RO1. And if the multi-PI thing strengthens it in some way, or if the project's so big that you need, like it's a CTSA, you need more than one. But the thing I'd be concerned about is maybe the more senior person kind of co-opting your work and taking credit.
There need to be a pretty clear multi-PI plan, which is a requirement for the grant anyhow, to specify how you're going to manage it and who's going to do what when and what happens if you disagree. And these are things that they want you to write down, and you should.
To me, the multi-PI thing has a little bit more to do with the size of the project and the amount of work. Maybe if there's more than one site involved.
Or if you're bringing complementary expertise in the area of team science, if somebody's more lab-oriented and somebody's more clinically oriented, and you're trying to do a truly translational project where you need that aggregate expertise, that may be a very reasonable way to achieve that.
The only other factor I would think is how your promotion and tenure committee considers multi-PI versus single PI. They're supposed to value it just as much, but they may not. You may have to show, depending on what your field is, whether, kind of basic science, if you need to demonstrate independence from your mentor, in which case you might have to do it by yourself. I don't know. There's all kinds of considerations. Sometimes it usually works really well, but sometimes you got to take other factors into account. The senior person might come to you and say, "Oh, you need my help on it. You need my name on this." That's where I get a little nervous. Because are they being truly altruistic and unselfish, or are they trying to take some credit for what you're doing? I don't know. Right? Yeah.
So I'm the business school professor, and I hang out with this group because I'm very interested in the translation of science from discovery to actual cures, improved
We're
health,
terrible at it. Yeah.
through commercialization. And but looking at the survey, no one seems to even be talking about that maybe an SBIR or commercialization is the end game, not an R or a publication. So, how do we help people think about, is research a means to an end or the end in itself?
Yeah, we had some discussion about training in like entrepreneurship and stuff like that. At some CTSA hubs, that's a big deal. At others, it's like non-existent. I don't know what it's like here. Do you have courses in it, or do people take them? Yeah.
Well, he's a sort of regional leader in this.
Okay. That tends to vary quite a bit across the consortium. Some places do a lot of device development, others don't.
But I think something that, I've listened to your talk for a long time, and I've never really known how well one can support oneself as a researcher off an SBIR grant. I know that I just don't have any sense of what the budgets are and whether it's a viable career path, really, or if it's really only good for people who are leaving academics and going into a sort of startup business kind of approach. And so I think that's one of the things that we don't teach, or at least I haven't been open to hearing. And so it's just still sort of an unknown to a lot of people of how it plays into your career plan.
That is a very good point. And when you looked at what sources of revenue support your salary,
Right.
that people just aren't as familiar with royalties or SBIRs or other types of commercial-based funding that could augment your lab. So great area of training opportunity. Becky, let's talk.
Yes, I think we do have something scheduled next week, don't we?
All right, any other questions or comments for Dr. Tsevat?